So in this video, I want to look a little bit at a rather, well, this video and in a couple of other videos as well. It'll probably take me a few to get through this article. I want to look at Michel Foucault's work, What is an Author? It's an essay around 1969. There's various versions of it that have come down since when he originally delivered it in the late 60s, and I'll be using the one that's translated into English, and it appears in the Foucault Reader. And this is taking it from another source. But anyways, this one here, you can trace it back. This is edited by Paul Rabineau. All right, so just as a tiny bit of background to this paper, think about a little bit from Samuel Beckett, the great Irish writer who lived in Paris, wrote in French, and translated some of his French writings into English and whatnot. Kind of around the time of James Joyce, so the early 20th century. Very, you could call him an existentialist type of writer. Waiting for Godot and works like that. So very famous playwright and poet, and wrote really interesting materials. The particular thing that's important to us here is one of his works that comes out about 1966, a collection called Texts for Nothing. And in one of these, one of the works in Texts for Nothing, one of the characters says something like this: what does it matter who is talking? What does it matter who's speaking? Let's just look at the speaking itself rather than worrying about kind of the speaker. And in other words, there is a kind of indifference to the author. So I've indicated that by a little asterisk. So this is sort of Beckett's indifference to the author. What does it matter, right? And he's not saying that there is no speaker or anything like that. No, of course there is. But what does it matter, right? So in a sense, this is not unlike what we often do in philosophy. Less so today, but certainly more classic ways of interpreting texts. We didn't care much about the interpretation of a text by the author. So if you read Kant or whatever, you didn't really care too much about, at least when I was being trained, you didn't care too much about Kant's personal history or his personal views or whatever. You just looked at his work, his philosophy, and tried to figure out the meaning there. So you weren't looking through his diaries and trying to find meanings that could be brought into when you, let's say, read some of his works, like the Three Critiques, right? And you say you would just look at those in and of themselves. Rather than going into the background of the author, right? So it's not unknown in scholarship that there was, this indifference to the author, but nobody denied that Kant existed. It's just for a while people didn't care too much about his personal life. That was for biographers, wasn't really for scholarly interpretation. Okay, so we have this, but this authorial kind of stuff, became, a pretty hot topic in the 60s. And we've already seen, I've done a couple of videos on the Wimsatt and Beardsley view, the fallacies, right? The intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. And they were trying to do something similar to this. Like, let's get away from authors and readers. And in other words, you don't worry too much about the author, because then you're doing authorial intent and all that, and you're off in the land of biography and you lose sight of the poem, kind of a form of the genetic fallacy. And then if you go the other one in the affective fallacy, all you do is worry about the poem's effects on the reader, and then you lose sight of the poem in that direction. So, on one side, from the intentional fallacy, you become too concerned with the causes of the poem and mistake the causes of the poem for the norms of interpretation. So that's a problem. Or the other one, in the affective fallacy, you mistake the effects of the poem for the poem, and then you get bound up in the effects of it, and you're looking at individuals, readers and whatnot. And both of those, they thought, ended you in sort of this morass of subjectivity, right? The poem is lost, and all we're talking about are either intentions or feelings or whatnot, and neither of those are really anything that critics can really get a grip on. So this notion of being very suspicious of reading authors and things like that is extremely important. That comes earlier than the 60s. So, but it comes roaring out in the 60s, and a very famous article on it was by Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, right? You know, and this doesn't mean that anybody died or anything like that. It's just, read this very metaphorically. In other words, kind of this Beckett-like indifference. Like, so what if the author, you know, who cares about the author? And the death of the author is like the death of the author as an important part of interpretation, right? Not that there aren't any flesh and blood authors. That's never been denied, right? Okay, so we have this sort of drinking water of the 60s in literary interpretation that sometimes referred to as this sort of era of authorial uncertainty, right? In other words, you know, we could be uncertain, or it's not, it doesn't matter about the author. Okay, so anyways, we could go into a lot more background, but that's all I'm going to say for now. So Foucault comes in, you know, as Barthes reacted, you know, partially and to Beckett. This 1969 work by Foucault is a reaction, at least in part. You know, again, he's in the drinking water of authorial uncertainty. He's reacting to Barthes' Death of the Author. Now, and to unpack all that, we'd have to go into Barthes' article and how Foucault is reacting to it. I'm not doing that. I'm going to basically not look at the cause of Foucault's work. I'm going to get away from that, and I'm just going to look at a little bit at Foucault's work itself and try to unpack, I think, what's roughly going on in there. And I say roughly because there's a ton of stuff in this work by Foucault, and we could spend, you know, dozens of videos on it. So I'm just going to try and hit the highlights starting in this video and in a couple succeeding videos. Okay, so Foucault starts out by saying, you know, think about this concept of the author and work, the concept of it, right? You know, this is very important to us, right? In today's age, you know, we, especially today, we are really looking a lot at authors, right? You know, who they were, what they did, what they said outside of their works. And we use a lot of that in judging whether or not we're going to read works, because, you know, a lot of people say it's very problematic. If an author who's written a piece of work I may like, maybe an author has written a novel I really like, or a poem I really like, or whatever, has produced a work that I really quite like, then I find out that the author has some pretty, you know, let's say pretty reprehensible views on other subjects. Maybe those subjects aren't even in the work that I like, but the author has all kinds of views that maybe I find distasteful. And so a lot of people are very concerned about that now. And really a tight, you know, well, should I read that author? Is it okay to still like an author's work if that author, I think, is morally, you know, a bad person? So this seems to have a fairly robust thing, as Foucault says, you know, fairly concrete, quite solid, this notion of an author and work, right, as a concept, as opposed to, you know, like a school of philosophy as a concept. And this is a simplify, which means philosophy. So the school of philosophy seems a more abstract type concept, or a literary genre, things like that. But author and work seems quite a concrete notion. Now, like school of philosophy or literary genre as concepts, the author and work came into shall we say, Foucault says, comes into being. It started, it has a history as a concept, right? Concepts have history, just like lots of other things. Concepts, if you like, ways of talking, right, has a history. So the way of talking and thinking about, you know, literary texts that's bound up with authors and all that, that comes into history. If you think about really, really old stuff, you know, like works, and they tend to be kind of religious in nature. If you think about them, you don't really hear much about authors, right? I mean, historians might try and figure out who wrote, you know, something in the Bible or whatever. But a lot of these, or, you know, like think about the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. Who wrote that, right? So a lot of, and the thing is that a lot of, when those texts were written, it wasn't really the case that people talked about author and work. That really wasn't a concept. It was, people would talk about the work, and people didn't doubt that someone maybe, you know, physically wrote it out, but they didn't worry too much about the authors. They were just worried more about, they thought more about the work. So this connection right? This term that binds authors and works comes into being at a certain time, and it's robust and all that, but nonetheless, it has a history, as concepts do. Ways of talking do have histories. And Foucault says this is like a privileged moment of individualization, right? The notion of the author and connected to a work, right? And so he says, okay, again, author and work, this could be told, the story of this as it comes into being and the history of this concept could be told in a variety of ways. You could talk about author and work in terms of its something like its economic history, like when did authors, have the notion of copyright and where it was monetarily exclusive to an author, right? So the money that was made from something had to go to the author, or there was some kind of copyright infringement, or some kind of law had been broken, right? Well, that does have a history. And also plagiarism, that too, as a concept, which is linked up to authors and works, that too has a history, and quite fascinating. Like, because when you look at ancient texts, for instance, they would often just take stuff from each other's work. There wasn't really a notion of footnoting or copyright. There wasn't even a notion of really originality in the same way that we have it today. So author and work is bound up to unpack that way of talking about texts and people. That has a history and can be told in a variety of ways. And Foucault's like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm just looking at the relationship between the author and a text, so this particular relationship. So he's narrowing it down. And he's also interested in how does a text, like a written work or whatever, how does it point to an author that's, antecedent to it or outside of it. So he's interested in looking at that. Okay, so he's going to start then, after he does this little intro bit, he picks up on the thing I indicated, this indifference, this Beckettian indifference to the author. And he says inside of this kind of indifference, this Beckettian indifference, is a fundamental ethical principle. Ethical, I mean, that tends to conjure up certain kinds of norms. But think of it just that it's an immanent norm or rule. You don't think of norms as kind of like rules, like you should do this as a rule in the practice of writing. And what does that mean? Well, he doesn't really tell us, but he says, I'm not going to, he doesn't really explain what the rule is, but he's going to look at two themes of this ethical principle, this immanent norm, that help unpack what it is. And so he's going to start by looking at the link historically and kind of this breaking of it historically that writing had to expression and that writing had to death and immortality and things like that. So in the next video, I'll go into some more detail on this. So the main takeaway when you think of this whole thing is Foucault wants to really examine, as he says, what exactly really is an author? It's got a story, a historical story, but what exactly is this relationship? And what's this going to be when you examine it in more detail? What exactly is this thing going to turn out to be? And it's quite different than what, is often spoken of in the question of an author. In any case, see you next video.